The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Popular Sovereignty. Presented by Mindy Grossenbacher, supported by resources obtained from the Kansas Historical Society. Yesterday we talked about what was going on in the United States leading up to the Civil War and how Kansas played an important role in that situation. Before the Civil War began, politicians were divided over several issues, including slavery. As the borders of the United States pushed west, politicians debated over the issue and whether or not states should enter the Union as free states or slave states. Watch the video for a review on the events leading up to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the issues of the day.
Today, when people complain about the state of American politics, they often mention the dominance of the Democratic and Republican parties, or the sharp split between red and blue states. But while it may seem like both of these things have been around forever, the situation looked quite different in 1850, with the Republican Party not yet existing, and support for the dominant Democrats and Whigs cutting across geographic divides. The collapse of this second-party system was at the center of increasing regional tensions that would lead to the birth of the Republican Party, the rise of Abraham Lincoln as its leader, and a civil war that would claim over 500,000 lives. And if this collapse could be blamed on a single event, it would be the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The story starts with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. To balance the number of slave states and free states in the Union, it allowed slavery in the newly admitted state of Missouri, while making it off-limits in the remaining federally administered Louisiana Territory. But compromises tend to last only as long as they're convenient, and by the early 1850s, a tenacious Democratic senator from Illinois named Stephen A. Douglas found its terms very inconvenient. As an advocate of Western expansion, he promoted constructing a transcontinental railroad across the northern plains with an eastern terminus in Chicago, where he happened to own real estate. For his proposal to succeed, Douglas felt that the territories through which the railroad passed would have to be formally organized, which required the support of Southern politicians. He was also a believer in popular sovereignty, arguing that the status of slavery in a territory should be decided by its residents rather than Congress. So Douglas introduced a bill designed to kill two birds with one stone. It would divide the large chunk of incorporated land into two new organized territories, Nebraska and Kansas, each of which would be open to slavery if the population voted to allow it. While Douglas and his Southern supporters tried to frame the bill as protecting the political rights of settlers, horrified Northerners recognized it as repealing the 34-year-old Missouri Compromise and feared that its supporters' ultimate goal was to extend slavery to the entire nation. Congress was able to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but at the huge cost of bitterly dividing the nation, with 91% of the opposition coming from Northerners. In the House of Representatives, politicians traded insults and brandished weapons until a sergeant-at-arms restored order. President Pierce signed the bill into law amidst a storm of protest. While Georgia's Alexander Stephens, future Confederate vice president, hailed the act's passage as glory enough for one day, the New York Tribune reported, "The unanimous sentiment of the North is indignant resistance." Douglas even admitted that he could travel from Washington, D.C. to Chicago by the light of his own burning effigies. The political consequences of the Kansas-Nebraska Act were stunning. Previously, both Whigs and Democrats had included Northern and Southern lawmakers united around various issues. But now slavery became a dividing factor that could not be ignored. Congressmen from both parties spoke out against the act, including an Illinois Whig named Abraham Lincoln, denouncing the monstrous injustice of slavery in an 1854 speech. By this time, the Whigs had all but ceased to exist, irreparably split between their Northern and Southern factions. In the same year, the new Republican Party was founded by the anti-slavery elements from both existing parties. Although Lincoln still ran for Senate as a Whig in 1854, he was an early supporter of the new party and helped to recruit others to its cause. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party was shaken when events in the newly formed Kansas Territory revealed the violent consequences of popular sovereignty. Advertisements appeared across the North, imploring people to emigrate to Kansas to stem the advance of slavery. The South answered with border ruffians, pro-slavery Missourians who crossed state lines to vote in fraudulent elections and raid anti-slavery settlements. One Northern abolitionist, John Brown, became notorious following the Potawatomi Massacre of 1856, when he and his sons hacked to death 5 pro-slavery farmers with broadswords. In the end, more than 50 people died in Bleeding, Kansas. While nominally still a national party, Douglas's Democrats were increasingly divided along sectional lines, and many Northern members left to join the Republicans. Abraham Lincoln finally took up the Republican Party banner in 1856 and never looked back. That year, John C. Fremont, the first Republican presidential candidate, lost to Democrat James Buchanan, but garnered 33% of the popular vote, all from northern states. 2 years later, Lincoln challenged Douglas for his Illinois Senate seat, and although he lost that contest, it elevated his status among Republicans. Lincoln would finally be vindicated in 1860 when he was elected President of the United States, defeating in his own home state a certain Northern Democrat who was finally undone by the disastrous aftermath of the law he had masterminded. Americans today continue to debate whether the Civil War was inevitable, but there is no doubt that the Kansas-Nebraska Act made the ghastly conflict much more likely. And for that reason, it should be remembered as one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history.
The most influential piece of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the idea of popular sovereignty. Let's start with this term. What is it, and what was its role in the Kansas-Nebraska Act? According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, popular sovereignty was a pre-Civil War doctrine asserting the right of the people living in a newly organized territory to decide by vote of their territorial legislature whether or not slavery would be permitted. But whose idea was it? Popular sovereignty wasn't a new idea. It was first proposed in the 1840s to resolve the issue of slavery in the new U.S. territories. Stephen Douglas promoted it for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. As territories and states were added to the U.S., different parties argued over the imbalance between free and slave states. That's why Stephen Douglas, if you remember from the video, a senator from Illinois, suggested popular sovereignty, the state's choice, to promote a solution to the issue. Who was Stephen Douglas? Well, Stephen Douglas was a Democratic senator from Illinois. He believed in manifest destiny, which, if you remember from a previous lesson, that manifest destiny was the belief that expanding the borders of the U.S. throughout the American continent was justified and inevitable. And he had already suggested popular sovereignty for Utah and New Mexico territories when they were formed. Now, Stephen Douglas proposed popular sovereignty for the Kansas-Nebraska issue, thinking that this might be a solution to win over both parties. Although, in the end, it became an unpopular solution for abolitionists. Abolitionists were against slavery, and especially for increasing the amount of states who allowed slavery. Eventually, Stephen Douglas would face Abraham Lincoln as they both ran for senator for the state of Illinois. He had previously served in the House of Representatives and the Senate before that occurrence. Now, Douglas initially won against Abraham Lincoln in the run for the Senate seat. He beat Abraham Lincoln in 1858 and the new Republican Party. However, they were both considered excellent speakers, and 2 years later, Lincoln was voted the 16th President of the United States of America. Now, why did Douglas promote popular sovereignty within the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Well, let's watch this video for a little review over what we learned.
Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened a vast new area of the American heartland to settlement, but it also opened the region to the possible spread of slavery and ignited a firestorm that launched the country on the path to civil war. The territory was acquired from the French 50 years earlier in the Louisiana Purchase. It had been set aside for Indians and closed to white settlement. But business interests wanted it, mainly to build a transcontinental railroad through it. The Indian rights were rescinded, and Senator Stephen Douglas introduced a bill to organize the region into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, a necessary step for future development.
Stephen A. Douglas, the senator from Illinois, who was really the most prominent political figure of the 1850s, even though he never was elected president, developed this idea he called popular sovereignty, which was basically that the people of the territories should decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to have slavery.
Douglas believed he needed at least the possibility of allowing slavery in the new territories to get the support of Southern Democrats for his bill. But Douglas had played with fire. The act overturned the Missouri Compromise, which 3 decades earlier had banned slavery anywhere north of latitude 3630.
So in effect, what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did was destabilize the understandings that were part of the territorial question.
And the result was Bleeding Kansas.
Bleeding Kansas was the name given the outbreak of violence in that territory sparked by this new legislation.
There was a civil war in Kansas between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery forces. It was never clear who was going to decide. Did the first 10 people into a territory decide?
Anti-slavery settlers raced to Kansas to try to be the people who would decide the issue. Thousands of pro-slavery settlers crossed from the slave state of Missouri to counter them, often violently, and cast ballots in favor of making Kansas a slave state as well. By 1858, clashes between the two sides had claimed 200 lives. This violence eventually spilled over into the Civil War, which would go on to claim 200,000 lives by 1865.
There was a lot going on during the settlement of the Kansas Territory. And so, to find out a little bit more about what was happening and what truly was being said and the true events, one of the ways we can learn about history is through a primary source. That is, going to the source to find reliable information. A primary source offers you the best information. Whether or not you agree with Douglas's opinions, the fact remains that he was a popular speaker during this time, well-spoken, and a proponent of ideas that many supported. If you want to understand someone's viewpoint, it's best to go to the source. That's where primary sources come into play. Now, what is a primary source? Well, it can be personal narratives, a recording or written record of someone's retelling of an event or experience. It can be interviews, a reporter getting a first-hand retelling from someone who witnessed or was part of an event. It can be newspapers, a resource from the time of an event where narrators or reporters witnessed or were part of the event. It can be diaries, a personal account written for someone's own record keeping, and it can be letters, a personal account written to share with another. Here is a primary source. This is a speech from Stephen Douglas as he defended the Kansas-Nebraska Act while addressing Congress. This portion of his speech was shared in the Congressional Globe in 1854. Take a listen. Mr. President, when I proposed on Tuesday last that the Senate should proceed to the consideration of the bill to organize the territories of Nebraska and Kansas, it was my purpose only to occupy 10 or 15 minutes in explanation of its provisions. Upon the other point, that pertaining to the question of slavery in the territories, It was the intention of the committee to be equally explicit. We took the principles established by the Compromise Act of 1850 as our guide, and intended to make each and every provision of the bill accord with those principles. Those measures established and rest upon the great principle of self-government, that the people should be allowed to decide the questions of their domestic institutions for themselves, subject only to such limitations and restrictions as are imposed by the Constitution of the United States, instead of having them determined by an arbitrary or geographical line. The original bill reported by the committee as a substitute for the bill introduced by the senator from Iowa was believed to have accomplished this object. The amendment, which was subsequently reported by us, was only designed to render that clear and specific which seemed, in the minds of some, to admit of doubt and misconstruction. In some parts of the country, the original substitute was deemed and construed to be an annulment or a repeal of what has been known as the Missouri Compromise, while in other parts it was otherwise construed. As the object of the committee was to conform to the principles established by the compromise measures of 1850, and to carry those principles into effect in the territories, we thought it was better to recite in the bill precisely what we understood to have been accomplished by those measures, the that the Missouri Compromise, having been superseded by the legislation of 1850, has become inoperative, and hence we propose to leave the question to the people of the states and the territories, subject only to the limitations and provisions of the Constitution. What does the source say? Well, it gives a different label. Douglas doesn't call popular sovereignty. He calls it a principle of self-government. In his definition, that means the people should be allowed to decide questions of their domestic institutions themselves. He does set limitations for this self-government. They should be set by the Constitution of the United States and its limitations and restrictions. So let's take it a step further. How do you feel about the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Well, you're going to choose a side. You and your classmates will join the side of Lincoln and the Republicans, or Douglas. You should have been assigned your team during the previous class. If not, simply choose a side. For whatever side you are assigned, provide 3 reasons to support your side. So you will either not support the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or you will support the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Do not argue on the basis of slavery at this time. Support your arguments considering the rights of states according to the U.S. Constitution, using notes from this lesson, previous lessons, and your textbook. Save your notes and save your 3 arguments because we will be using them later on when we gather together as a class.